If you listen to what is said by Vladimir Putin over this weekend, what is being said by senior NATO leaders, you might be under the impression that both sides are continuing to move down an arc that almost inevitably will lead to war. Whether that's the case or not, both sides claim that they want to deter the other. But if we're in one of those security dilemmas to where our actions, instead of causing things to be knocked down or to move towards stability or deterrence on the other side, is actually having the opposite effect. We'll see if that's actually going to play out or if it's going to actually succeed one way or the other. We're going to do that today with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, one of the best analysts there is on anything about security and diplomatic issues. Colonel Macgregor is a defense and foreign policy analyst and former advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Colonel Macgregor, welcome back to the show as always.
Yeah, good to be here.
And I'm really grateful to have you on today because a lot of things have been happening over the last few days, over the weekend especially, and I'm real interested to get your take on some of this stuff because there's always what's said publicly, and then there's what's actually going on behind the scenes and what that's going to translate into on the ground. That's one of the reasons we love to have you on, because you cut through all that stuff and give us a really good assessment of it. I want to take off, first of all, on over the weekend, there was something put on by President Putin in Moscow. It was called Everything for Victory. There's this new movement that they have going on. There's called the People's Front. Then they're trying to mobilize the entire population to go on to Russia. Here's what Putin said over the weekend is the reason for he's doing this.
The People's Front has truly become a massive social movement, thanks to the support of the vast majority of Russian citizens. Their desire to stand together for the principles and values that our ancestors passed on to us, to fight and work for the common result, the national success, peace and security of our children. I would like to note that since its creation, the People's Front has taken responsibility for solving the most complex and urgent issues, where it is difficult, where real, not paper, work is needed, where large projects need to be implemented, to respond to challenges, to unite the energy of people's aspirations. I repeat, the People's Front has become an effective institute of civil society, civil solidarity, consolidation, public participation, and control.
Now, certainly for domestic audiences, those words would seem to be very appealing. But you were telling me just before we went on the air that there are different views in Russia about this.
Well, I think it's important to understand that from the very beginning, President Putin declined to use the term war. He talked about the special military operation, and he was very sensitive to avoiding anything that would disturb domestic peace. In other words, he wanted to maintain the standard of living, ensure that everybody essentially got everything they wanted to eat or purchase or buy. They worked very hard to circumvent sanctions, which has turned out to be an art, and they've done that very successfully. Their economy is humming. Is it doing as well as he would like? Probably not, but by our standards, compared to things here where we're adjusting our GDP for the last quarter down to almost zero, I think they're doing very, very well. Now, there have been some developments. First of all, much to his disappointment, though I think he should never have expected anything different, he thought that he would be able to work with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump would work with him and bring this war in Ukraine to an end. Well, that hasn't happened. And the only way that the war in Ukraine is going to end is if the Russians end it. Now, I think that's coming. It's coming a little late, frankly, and that's the point. I spoke very recently within the last 24 hours to some Russians, and specifically one, with connections in St. Petersburg. And his point to me was very straightforward. He said, Americans don't understand that in Russia, people are discontented, not with Putin personally or with his management of the economy or his overall competence. They don't understand why the war in Ukraine has taken this long. They think that if you're going to go to war, you should go to war. In other words, everything should be mobilized. Everything in the country should be committed to winning the war and ending it on terms that meet Russian needs. But the key point is winning it and ending it. This thing has gone on in the view of many, many Russians too long. That's not just the man in the street. That's people in his inner circle. That's people in the government. So now he's come out and said, well, now we're getting ready to go to war. Well, what's changed? Ukraine is not recovering. In fact, the latest figures I've received from multiple sources, including those in Eastern Europe, of people that have been watching this carefully, is that 265,000 Ukrainians have been killed just within the last 6 months. In other words, January through June. We're talking about 265,000 Ukrainian troops. This would bring the total of losses up to probably 1.7, 1.8 million.
Wow.
We find that incomprehensible, but I'm afraid it's not. And anybody who knows what real war is like knows from historical experience that's not outrageous. What's interesting is that the losses on the Russian side have been so minimal. And we think they may have lost 120, 130,000 killed, but that's starting back in 2022. Well, there's reasons for that, and we've discussed that before. Armies in retreat that are disintegrating, falling apart, they tend to take much heavier losses. Most of the German losses in World War II occurred in the last 9 months of the war, when things were falling apart and disintegrated. So that should not surprise us, but it does surprise a lot of people. Now, what does all of this mean? There's something else that's happening. President Putin and his leadership were understandably very focused on Ukraine. And being so focused on Ukraine, I think they took their eye off the ball in the Caucasus. They weren't watching carefully what Mr. Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, was up to. I don't think they really worried about it because Aliyev's father, who was a KGB major general, a member of the Politburo, and was viewed as absolutely loyal to both the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia, suggested there was nothing to worry about in Azerbaijan. Well, that's turned out to be wrong. The Azeris have formed a very close relationship with Israel, and that relationship also includes Greater Turkey, in other words, Mr. Erdogan. But primarily Israel and Erdogan and the United States all share a similar interest right now in Azerbaijan. That is to destabilize and harm Iran in any way possible. Well, what's the worst thing that could happen to Iran? Well, the worst thing that could happen to Iran is for the Iranian country, the nation itself, to break up. And we know for a very long time that Iran has had various pockets of nationalities, though well integrated and part of the Iranian national state and society, they nevertheless still exist. And that includes the Azeri Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There is now a definite, deliberate, conscious, use whatever terms you want, plan to invade northern Iran by Azerbaijan in the hopes of raising a rebellion in northwestern Iran, centered around Tabriz, which is the center of the Turkic population in northwestern Iran. There are lots of Azeris in Iran who are currently interested in this. So the threat to Iran is very real. That's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that Azerbaijan was already offering or providing a platform for use by the Mossad, MI6, and CIA against Iran. We're not sure how much was used. In other words, did they launch drones? Probably. But they certainly moved agents from Azerbaijan into Iran, which were then able to set up and cause havoc inside Iran during the 12-day war. So this is part of the problem. And then you have to look further to the west at Syria, understand that Syria is basically part of Greater Turkey. Everything that happens in Syria happens because Mr. Erdogan wants it to or doesn't want it to. Jolani is not an independent agent. He is a figurehead. And Erdogan, for the moment, wants to get along with the Jewish state. However, there are limitations to his cooperation.
And I'm sorry, Doug, Jelani is a figurehead, and who's pulling his strings?
Erdogan. Jelani is just a figurehead in Syria that we, the Israelis, MI6, in other words, US CIA, and Erdogan installed. So Erdogan was always interested in dislodging Assad, but for reasons that were different from the Israelis. The Israelis are now in southern Iran, and they intend to stay there, or so they say. This is a permanent point of friction with Turkey. The Turks would like to see the Russians leave, but they don't want a confrontation with the Russians. But they would like to control what today we call northern Lebanon, as well as this enclave of Syria that touches the Mediterranean. So the Turks have certain goals in the region. The Israelis have their own greater Israel goals. Azerbaijan wants to create greater Azerbaijan as part of a greater Turkic enclave or confederation, if you will, with the hope of eventually exercising some degree of hegemony over the region. Then you have Iran to the south of Azerbaijan that is preparing for another round in the war. I think they expect the war to restart probably in September. It will take that long for radars, missiles, munitions, and other things to find their way to Israel. So they're preparing for the next round of war. And at the same time, they're looking at this probable invasion from Azerbaijan, which they probably expect to coincide with an Israeli resumption of the war against them. Now, if you're sitting in Moscow and you realize all of these things have happened, it's unraveling to some extent Moscow's southern security area. In other words, Azerbaijan was seen as a component of Russian security strategy, as a friend, as someone that would be a force for stability. Azerbaijan has turned out to be the opposite. So the Russians are going, I think, to accelerate the end of the war in Ukraine. That may mean more devastation and death inside Ukraine, simply because no one will step forward in Europe or Ukraine to negotiate an end. But this incentivizes the Russians to move quickly, and when I say quickly, within weeks, to terminate what's happening in Ukraine. They need now to focus on the Caucasus. They don't want to become embroiled in a war in the Caucasus, but they can't stand by and watch this destabilizing influence that the Israeli, Azerbaijani, and American axis is creating, because they can't allow Iran to simply be broken up. Now, keep in mind, Iran's not going to sit there quietly and allow the northwestern part of its country to be cut off and incorporated into Azerbaijan either. But these are all now connected. Everything that we're discussing is connected. And the Russians have a very powerful ground force, as you know, very powerful missile force. I think their armed forces, if you had to pick a time for them to operate and fight, is probably now better than ever. But when you put all of what I just discussed together, you get the rationale for what President Putin is saying. He's saying, look, we are at war. We are being attacked on multiple sides. We have to prepare for this. We have to be prepared to act decisively to win.
And it could well be that. In fact, I have one more soundbite from that speech, which would seem to taper in pretty nicely to what you just said, because he's here talking about the external aggression.
And when our country, our people faced a direct threat, increasing external aggression, new punitive operations against the residents of Donbass and Novorossiya, the People's Front undertook the very work, the very mission that it was obliged to undertake, because the People's Front is a part of our people. Starting in February 2022, you have deployed and provided worldwide support to our heroes on the front lines, to the defenders of the motherland, their families, the armed forces, the defense industry, everyone who fulfills their patriotic human duty.
And he went on there to specifically talk about, I want to completely mobilize the whole population. Sewing battalions, private firms have been helping with drones, volunteering, vehicles, household items, etc. $2 billion, he says, has been destroyed of Western kit has been destroyed by these people, whatever. He goes on there to just really emphasize a lot of detail about how he's trying to incorporate everybody in there. And you're suggesting that this may all be timed now. And because that's the question, why at 3.5 years would you be doing this when it seems like, in one hand, that, maybe the Ukraine side, especially with those casualties, you can't sustain that, too much longer, I wouldn't think. But now then this is going up. So you expect that this could be rather a precursor to an increased combat operation in Ukraine?
I think so, but I think it's also a message to us, Dan. He's not just signaling the Russian people that this is coming. There are many, many Russians that have said this should have happened 2-3 years ago. So I think that may not make everyone thrilled, but they understand what's happening. They understand the threats on all sides, the threats from the Caucasus, the threats from Eastern Europe. This is not new in Russian history. If you go back to the czars, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, I would say certainly up until the 1860s, the Russians were engaged militarily almost as frequently in the Caucasus and southern Russia as they were in Eastern Europe. They had problems on both ends. So this is not new, and I think they're prepared to handle it. But I think the message is being sent to us. You need to understand something, Washington. We know what you're doing. We understand the relationship between you, the Israelis, Erdogan, and Aliyev. In other words, Turkey and Azerbaijan. We understand that you want to destroy the unity, the integral state of Iran, because you also want to destroy the One Belt, One Road. You want to destroy the commercial and economic infrastructure that Russia and China are trying to build in Central Asia. You are trying to isolate us. I mean, that's really his message. And he's saying it's not going to work because we will fight. Now, there's a problem here, and that's us. Are we prepared to really fight a major war? He knows we're not. And all he has to do is look at the economy. And before we're through, we should touch on the financial system and the economy and the impact of the big, beautiful bill, among other things.
Well, that's a perfect transition because that's exactly where I'd like for us to go, and that is on the financial issue in BRICS. So, Gary, a little bit out of order here. If you can put up that full screen that last night Trump put on Truth Social, a warning and a threat. Any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions to this policy. And then that weird thing, thank you for your attention to this matter. BRICS is not responding well to it. There was some comment this morning where they issued some warnings of their own, trying to not antagonize Trump and didn't go directly to it. But the aggravation is quite clear. Now, for those who may not know, and obviously you do, but for our audience here, I want to show them, because a lot of times when people hear this term BRICS, they don't know what it means, or they think it's just some small thing. Not so much. Look at how much BRICS has actually expanded just in the last few years.
BRICS was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And in 2010, South Africa joined. And in 2024, BRICS added 5 new full members, which are Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And in 2025, BRICS added 10 partner states, which are on the path to full membership in the near future. Those countries are Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Together, these 10 members and 10 partners represent the BRICS 20, often referred to as BRICS Plus. And together, the BRICS 20 make up more than 2/5 of the global economy. BRICS Plus is 44% of global gross domestic product, GDP, when you measure it at purchasing power parity, PPP. 44%, over 2/5 of the world economy.
Okay, and that's a snapshot as of right now. BRICS is meeting right now in Rio de Janeiro, and they're again trying to expand their market share. More on that in just a second. But now then, let's look at what may be coming next. You mentioned the big beautiful bill, and obviously there's lots of diversity on whether that's going to be a disaster, a catastrophe, or a big beautiful thing. You can talk on that in a minute. But no matter whose version you look at, it's going to add huge amounts of debt onto an already huge burden on top of us. Now, how do you see all that playing out in terms of what the BRICS is doing with the U.S. system?
Well, remember that BRICS is the alternative to the U.S.-dominated financial system, which we created in the aftermath of the Second World War. We effectively stepped into the shoes of the British Empire. And then what emerged was the Anglo-American financial empire. In other words, we decided that we would create a system that would reward people for cooperating with us and giving us advantageous arrangements for trade, provided they used our dollar and slipped into this new Bretton Woods style financial system that effectively subordinated everybody's interest to our interest. Now, remember that for most people at the end of the Second World War, who were in poverty, who were in ruins, frankly, or were very, very behind in terms of economic development, it made sense to cooperate with us. But over time, this financial system has been employed as a means of bullying countries into submission. And we need to understand something. When we mention the dollar, we're talking about effectively a network where you use the dollar, you go through the SWIFT system, you settle all your accounts and debts with a dollar. And of course, you enter into what effectively is what we accuse the Chinese of, which is debt slavery. We accuse them of debt slavery. We're the ones that have been enslaving the world with debt by through this dollar network. How do you get out from under the dollar network? Well, first of all, you end up with gold as a reserve currency, which is, as Nassim Taleb points out, is increasingly a fact. And then secondly, you stop using dollars to the extent that you're able. Now, how do you do that? Well, you have to go to another system. What's the other system? BRICS. And they have this thing that the Chinese have helped develop called CIPS, which is the alternative to the SWIFT system, which is very modern, digital, and settles business across national lines. Why is all of this significant? Well, people are frankly sick of us because as time wore on, we weren't satisfied to bully people with financial means. We decided that we'd threaten them militarily if they did not do what we wanted. In other words, you own assets in a place like Senegal that has gold mines and produces 20% of its economy produces gold. And let us say that Senegal is in debt to the United States, to France, to Britain, to the Western financial system, and has been using dollars. And suddenly the people in Senegal said, well, we'll never get out from underneath this terrible debt that has been inflicted on us. They turn then to BRICS. And what does BRICS say? Forget that debt. Nationalize your assets, join us, and you can tell the West to fly a kite. Well, that's effectively where we're headed right now. In other words, the alternative network, the alternative to the dollar network, to the financial system we built, is emerging. It's emerging very quickly. It's far stronger, far more resilient, more modern in the case of CIPS, for instance, than SWIFT. And it's come online long before anybody thought it was possible. If you had told people 10 years ago that within 10 years, an alternative to the dollar-denominated financial system run by the United States and the Anglo-American financial empire would come along that quickly, everybody would say, well, that's impossible. These things take decades to build. Well, it's turned out that it's there. It's very real. So de-dollarization now is ongoing. So if you look at Iran and China, for instance, they do all of their business in their own currency. End of discussion. That is going to become the standard around the world. The map that you showed is very important because it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, gosh, that's most of the world. Yeah. That's most of the world's population. And you talked about 45% of global GDP. Well, where are we in terms of global GDP? We've fallen below 23%. You know, the time after World War II, we constitute almost 50% of it. The old order is dying.
Well, yeah, and in fact, that was one thing that Putin also this past weekend pointed out. And you talked about messages that maybe Putin was subtly sending. This one would seem a little bit more direct.
The combined GDP in purchasing power parity has already reached $77 trillion. That's according to IMF data for 2025. By the way, BRICS significantly outperform some other associations, including the Group of Seven. They have $57 trillion.
So he's saying, look, we're already outperforming as a bloc the G7. And of course, we've always viewed the G7 as the sine qua non of the global world, economic order, and everybody else has to follow behind. But now then, and you just alluded to it, when you just look at the numbers, actually, that's already shifted. Where does that tell you it's going?
It's telling us that the City of London banks and the New York City banks that are at the center of the Anglo-American financial empire are becoming more and more desperate with each passing day. Now, you've got to understand who is behind the war in Ukraine. That was no accident. We were trying to destroy Russia. Remember, we wanted to remove Putin, weaken the Russian state, ultimately divide it, then steal its resources and rape its population. Okay, now we're looking at Iran, a nation of 92 million that sits on enormous oil and gas resources. If you can't get to Russia and you're going broke, where do you go? You go to the Middle East. And that also converges with another long-term goal in the city of London and New York City and Washington, and that is to isolate China from the resources in the Middle East. In other words, who's going to buy the oil if we can shut it off in Iran? Now, they want to shut it off. They don't want to destroy it, although I suspect they will if they think they have to in order to gain control of it. But I think what they would rather do is break up Iran, do to Iran what they could not do to Russia, break it up, and then ultimately gain control of the resources. Now, is this all necessary? Well, you have another problem. You have Donald Trump. And why is Donald Trump a problem? Because Donald Trump embarked on this trade tariff war. And everybody said, oh, it's great. We're going to make these people pay for what they've done to us. What they've done to us or what we have done to them? Depends upon which side of the coin you want to look at. From the standpoint of most of the people on that map, we have exploited them. And so what's the answer? The answer that Donald Trump gives is, well, we're going to bully you even more now. We're going to punish you for doing what you're already doing. He's a little late to the party. The opportunity to punish people for doing what he says is over. It's done. That alternative to the dollar network exists. It's over. So punishing people for what they've already done is not going to change a thing. And then finally, he has this obsession with American military power. We're the greatest in the world. No one can stand against us. We're invincible. We're the best. Well, how much longer are you going to be able to say that? Especially if it turns out it's not really true.
Right.
This takes us back to what we just did in Iran. Was that a demonstration of our power, or was it something else? I mean, after all, we called and said we were coming. We told them what we were going to target. As it turned out, most of what was in these places had been removed, certainly the enriched uranium. There was nobody present there, and the Iranians said, okay. And then the next day, what did they do? They said, we're going to Bahrain. And they destroyed what was there. And of course, they knew we had already evacuated. And at the time, nobody seemed to understand that neither we nor the Iranians at that point really wanted to go to war. But is that acceptable to Netanyahu? What did we achieve for Israel? I mean, after all of this is about Israel. Would we be in Iran for any other reason? No, right. I don't think so.
Certainly not. No.
You know, why would we want to back an Azerbaijani invasion of northern Iran? Because Israel wants it. I mean, let's get down to basic facts here. So now we've got Mr. Netanyahu in Washington, and people are saying, well, what's Netanyahu telling Trump? I think he's telling Trump, you know, this is unacceptable. We have not fatally wounded the animal. You know, this is, if anything, a minor wound, and the animal is recovering. We have to finish off the wounded animal before it completely recovers.
Right. Yeah. And I'm actually going to take a look at that in just a second, because we're going to talk about Netanyahu's visit and several other factors that go along with that. But I'm wondering to what extent this next piece here, because we looked at the Russian portion of this, we looked at the BRICS issue and how the economics face, but then you look back to the military thing in the Western alliance with NATO. And you just mentioned that we claim that we're this most incredible lethal force in the history of the world, et cetera. But now we're going to more than double what we've been spending, allegedly anyway, over the next 10 years, which would imply that you're not all that great. But interesting in the way that Mark Rutte puts it here. And for the benefit of our viewers, you and I were chatting just a little bit before we came on air, that there is two separate entities involved here. There is Western Europe in terms of the people, and then there's Western in terms of the global elite who want to try to rule over all this stuff and continue to do the role they've had since World War II. How do you see this comment from Mark Rutte here, talking to a New York Times reporter on terms of what he wants to take the whole continent and where he wants to take the people to? Notice this.
We have an enormous geopolitical challenge on our hands. And that is, first of all, Russia, which is reconstituting itself at a pace and a speed which is unparalleled in recent history. They are now producing 3 times as much ammunition in 3 months as the whole of NATO is doing in a year. And don't forget, Russia is only the size of the economy of Texas, 2 trillion, and the whole of NATO is 50 trillion. So this is unsustainable. But the Russians are working together with the North Koreans, with the Chinese and the Iranians, the mullahs, in Ukraine, in fighting this war, unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. So here, the Indo-Pacific, Euro-Atlantic are getting more and more interconnected. We know that China has its eye on Taiwan. Given this whole geopolitical setup, there is no way we can defend ourselves if we would stick to this old 2%. So when it comes to core defense spending, we have to move up to 3.5%. And then, of course, there is all the defense-related spending, because a bridge needs to hold a tank if it crosses the bridge. We need to develop the defense industrial base. We need to spend money on cyber, on hybrid. We need to prepare our societies at large, so beyond the military. And that's the extra 1.5% leading into the 5%. So yes, this is an enormous amount of spending, but if we don't, we have to learn Russian. That's the short summary.
So that's the short deal, that Russia's definitely going to come and they're going to conquer all of us, and China's going to take Taiwan. And so I don't know why NATO has to worry about that, but that's what he cited here, and he wants to mobilize the populations of Europe. What do you make of all that?
Well, let's set aside the what I call the Anglo-American Israeli narrative about evil Russia and Iran and everything else, and let's look at it from a slightly different angle. When President Trump decided to push ahead with what he calls the big, beautiful bill, he signaled unambiguously that we had abandoned any pretense of fiscal discipline, of any pretense of dealing decisively with our sovereign national debt. So what is Rutte doing? He's doing the same thing. He's saying it doesn't matter that we're all heavily indebted. It doesn't matter that we've deindustrialized ourselves, much as we have, by shipping our manufacturing base overseas. None of these things matter. What matters is we now have to spend outrageously on the military power, on military industrial power, in order to confront this great threat that is looming in the East. Is it really about Russia? I don't think so. I think it has a lot more to do with how do these globalist elites stay in power? How does Starmer stay in power? How does Macron stay in power? Or this prize fool Merz? There is no enemy, and the enemy is not coming. If there is an enemy of civilization in Europe, it's the millions and millions of people from the Middle East and North Africa that have poured into Europe. And the Europeans were all told that if you don't accept these people and allow them to come in and take over your society, you're a racist, you're a Nazi. Well, that no longer works. The populations in Europe have said, enough. We can't deal with this. This is going to ruin our society. That's not what we voted for. The problem is that no real alternative that is backed by serious money and organization has emerged. There are alternatives, but they're not adequately supported. And in each of these countries, France, Germany, Great Britain, they have managed to maneuver to keep the usual globalist elites in power because they have the same problem we do. They have uniparties. In other words, if you're not in the alternative for Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, then you're in the uniparty. And the uniparty is keeping the AfD out of power. The uniparty is going to keep every nationalist in Europe out of power because nationalism is bound up with national identity, culture, religion, way of life. Nationalism is the enemy. that they cannot ultimately defeat. But they're going to try to do so by focusing everyone on this phony external enemy called Russia. And again, why are they so opposed to Russia? Because Russia is a national Russian state that rests on a foundation of Orthodox Christianity. And it has been successful at integrating Muslims into its society in an effective and positive way, to the point now where your Muslim population of 20 million inside Russia's 140 plus million is no less nationalistic and supportive of the Russian state than the Orthodox Christians. The point is, they're going to lose. Ruta is doomed. All of these people in Western Europe that are in this government are doomed. Unfortunately, they're going to continue to run these economies into the ground. Donald Trump is running us into the ground because they've all done what Donald Trump has done, thrown fiscal discipline overboard. It doesn't matter. We can spend as much as we want on the military, and we can still maintain everything that we have, our standard of living, the access to the high-end goods, access to all the food we want. And Dan, I don't think that's true. I think we're looking at a kind of structural inflation that we're not prepared for. We talk about the debasement of currency, but the bigger issue is the dollar. And as the dollar diminishes in terms as a store of value, and people turn increasingly to gold, what does that mean for dollar-denominated wealth anywhere, whether it's in Europe or the United States? Remember, we have the euro dollar, and Europe holds vast quantities of euro dollars. That's why when we go down financially, which is coming, they will go down with us. When that happens, all bets are off.
Well,
I
let
think
me ask you for
last
something.
desperate attempt. That's all this is, to stay in power.
And what if it's more than that? So I have no way to independently validate this, but I have heard a growing suspicion among some that, especially when you look at how we have just literally jettisoned any kind of fiscal discipline in terms of national debt. In fact, let's use a steam shovel to actually make it bigger. And this bill, by everyone's account, certainly does that. Europe is now the only way that they can jump to 5% is through more debt. Is that the allegation is that they meaning some unknown elites in the West writ large, actually want an actual conflict conventionally. They don't want it to go nuclear, but they do want a war with Russia, because then that would almost wipe the slates clean, because then you would have to go into this, then you could default and whatever, and you could fight this, and then maybe on the other end of it, come out on top and just wipe all this debt out. Do you put any credibility to that possibility?
No, I think the notion that war is going to rescue from your fiscal emergency is delusional and dangerous.
Right, but do people think that? That's the question.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it has more to do with what I said. Create the illusion of the threat to justify the spending, to justify the mobilization, to justify the surveillance state and the application of more laws that suppress free speech. Those are the things that are important to the globalist elites.
But so even from their perspective, though, because it would almost seem illogical to go down that path, because by swamping even more debt on there, this is not going to eliminate the debt. It's just going to keep it stacking up. And at some point, I mean, even by a globalist assessment, that's going to come down. How do they deal with that, as far as you know?
Well, I think they're kicking that can down the road, just as Donald Trump has. I mean, if you listen to his Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent, he has a scheme that has been employed in the past in the developing world to use Treasury bills, to go into the Treasury and use that as an artificial form of the Federal Reserve, and to effectively cope with debt in that manner. I mean, that deserves an hour of discussion on its own. This is what they call a strategy for financial dominance. I personally think that they're delusional and dangerous. I don't see that working at all. I see no alternative at some point to default. And the lesson of history is it's better to default early than later. You know, one of the things that nobody ever brings up is that we defaulted twice in the 30s under FDR, but we called it restructuring our debt. In 34 and 36, we couldn't pay. And the creditors said, that's all right, we'll restructure this. Now, why did they say that? Well, they knew that eventually we would recover come hell or high water. We had the largest skilled labor force in the world. We had the world's largest, most robust manufacturing base in the world. What do we have now? Neither. So who is going to deal with us? Who's going to help us? Who's going to willingly restructure things? Nobody. Plus the fact, if you look at President Trump and what he's just done in Iran, and you're a Korean or a Japanese or Chinese, and remember that part of the world, Vietnamese, all of these people share one thing in common. Well, more than one thing, but one thing in particular, the desire for stability and order. They want predictability because they see stability and order as a precondition for prosperity. And that's their focus. Their focus, contrary to popular belief, is not on building as many nuclear warheads as they can to destroy us. Right. That's crap. Okay. It's just nonsense. So that's where they're interested in. Why did the Koreans and the Japanese refuse to attend the NATO summit? They just said, we're not coming. We're not coming for reasons to do with what has just happened in Iran. And there was some other jargon in there, but the bottom line is they think we're crazy. They see Donald Trump as this dangerous, unbalanced individual who is governing our country. Now, in MAGA world, he's wonderful. Oh, everybody loves him. He's great. They think these expressions of extreme hubris are funny or entertaining or amusing. That's not the way the rest of the world looks at it. And
well, in fact, speaking of that, let's take a look at what's happening later today. There's going to be a meeting talking about MAGA world and Trump and making everything in front of people. Netanyahu is coming to the White House, and there's a lot of things on his agenda there. How do you see that plan, especially in terms of things you just talk about with the Azerbaijan situation, with Russia there, with Iran? I mean, a lot of things are on the plate today. What do you expect is going to happen behind closed doors?
Well, remember that 17 members of the Israeli Knesset are coming with President or Prime Minister Netanyahu. And their job is to lobby people on the Hill and in industry to support what Netanyahu wants. What does Netanyahu want? He wants the final solution for Gaza. Let's not lose sight of that. The most recent polling done by Hebrew University in Israel says that 81% of the population supports effectively genocide in Gaza. He wants to annex the West Bank. These are the things that he wants. Are we going to stop supporting him because we are uncomfortable with the mass murder and expulsion program in Gaza? Are we going to stop supporting him because we're not comfortable with another million plus Palestinians being driven away from their homes and pushed into somebody else's country? I don't think so. So I'm absolutely confident that the 17 Knesset members, along with Mr. Netanyahu, will absolutely secure continued cooperation and support for those policies.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the West Bank issue. That's actually been in the news here recently. Gary, if you could throw that headline up there. This is in a letter signed by 15 Likud ministers currently in government, as well as Speaker Ohana. The lawmakers wrote that after the state of Israel's historic achievements in the face of Iran's axis of evil and its sympathizers, the task must be completed, and the existential threat from within must be eliminated to prevent another massacre in the heart of our country. The politicians added that the strategic partnership, backing and support of the U.S. and President Donald Trump have made it a propitious time to move forward. So that seems to kind of validate exactly what you just said, that's what their intent here is to come, is to railroad President Trump in the United States. Is he going to allow that?
Absolutely. It's not a question of what he will allow. He'll receive instructions as to what is to be done. And that's what will happen. We need to understand something. If you're in the leadership of the Jewish state in the Middle East right now, you can do one of two things. You can pursue to its bitter end the policies that we're describing in both Gaza and the West Bank. You can pursue to its bitter end the destruction of the Iranian state in some way. We call that decapitation, regime change, whatever you want to call it. If we can break up the state, if we can create anarchy and chaos down there, whatever is required, with the help of Azerbaijan and the Turks, that's what we're going to do. And we are going to support that because the Jewish state understands that right now they have effective control of us. Let there be no mistake about it. The Hill and the White House are captives of the Israel lobby. If you look at key positions, the key people that surround the president, key people in the bureaucracy, defense, and State Department, and so forth, all of these people are creatures of the Israel lobby. Then you go across to the Senate, you start adding up, looking at the names of who's going to pass what legislation. You saw that in the interview between Tucker and Senator Cruz. I mean, these people are all alike. They have benefited in material and political ways from the connection with the Israel lobby. They are going to do what the Israel lobby wants. So these things will happen.
So what do you think of President Trump's claim over the weekend that I think that when Netanyahu comes here, we're going to get a ceasefire, 60-day ceasefire in the Gaza war leading to an end of the conflict? What do you make of that?
Well, you may get some kind of ceasefire, although none of the ceasefires that we've had were very meaningful. I don't think the alleged ceasefire right now between Iran and Israel is meaningful. I would view these things as pauses. Israel can use a pause. It's going to take between now and sometime in September for the Israelis to regain the missile arsenal, the radars, the integration, all of those things that are necessary to protect the Jewish state in the Middle East, and also sort of reinforce its striking power in the air and with missiles. That takes time. They absolutely need this pause. We kind of need a pause, but they need it more than we do, and we will shift whatever we have to them, and they know that. At the same time, whatever we have will be on standby for them at sea or in the air, and potentially even on land, depending upon where you are in the region. So I see September as the point when all of this sort of breaks into the open. So a 60-day agreement with Hamas is eminently possible. The problem is that Hamas knows that. Hamas wants an end to the war. They're not going to get that. They are scheduled for extinction. The only way out for Hamas and the people that live in Gaza is death or expulsion, one of the two. And that's the Israeli position. That is our position. We support it. Same thing is going to become true increasingly for the West Bank. And the same thing is effectively true for Iran. Either Iran collapses, disintegrates, or, we fail. And effectively, Trump was seen as having failed. Now, in reality, he didn't, because he bought the Israelis time, which they desperately needed. They needed the break in the war with Iran. And they still need time right now. Iran is pretty much recovered from what it went through during the 12-day war and is going to be much stronger, much more resilient, much more robust in the future. However, it has a vulnerability, and that vulnerability right now is northwestern Iran and Tabriz and the Azeri invasion. Now, I don't think the Iranians are going to take that sitting down. In other words, I think they'll react very, very decisively when the time comes, and that may mean missile strikes on Azerbaijan that the Azeris may not have reckoned with. We'll see. But the point is, this is where things are really headed. And what we do now is tactical. Strategically, the path into the future is set. What I described is where we're headed, what's going to happen. Our vulnerability, aside from potential weaknesses in the force structure and problems with the armed forces that we don't need to go into right now, the larger issue for us is financial. And since we've abandoned any pretense of fiscal discipline and we're piling on more debt, we are on the edge of the abyss, and we're going to fall into that abyss. And I don't know exactly when it happens or how it happens, but renewing your threats against nations with tariffs, reinvigorating the wars overseas and continuing to fight the ones that we've got. All of these things are going to coincide with problems here at home with the financial system. Jobless claims are up. The real estate market is grossly overpriced. So is the stock market. Everybody says, well, the stock market's way up. Remember that stocks investments are emotional events. People emote. It doesn't matter what reality is until reality bites you. And when reality bites, everything is over. But for the moment, it's all emotion. And when President Trump made the statement, I'm going to appoint someone to replace Jerome Powell who will cut interest rates, everybody goes to the market and buys, and the market goes up. But we don't control interest rates. The market controls interest rates. Why would we be able to hold interest rates down with the Fed and then watch yields rise in the bond market? You can't explain that except to recognize that what the Fed is doing is no longer meaningful to people that we're asking to invest in our bonds. And that's why this new strategy hatched by Secretary of the Treasury Bessent to avoid the bond disaster is underway. Now, I don't think it's going to work. I think the bond market's going to explode. The foreign investment that we need to sustain ourselves is not coming in.
Yeah.
I don't see that changing.
In the last few minutes we have here, Doug, that you've just described what you think is likely to happen, what all the signals indicate are going to happen, especially in terms of the Trump-Netanyahu meeting here. But if the government was actually following an America First agenda, what should the Trump administration do with this visit with Netanyahu?
Well, first of all, they're not following an American First agenda. If there were an American First defense policy or foreign policy, we would not be unconditionally bankrolling whatever the Israelis want to do. We would have been taken in by this event on 7 October in 2023 initially, but I think our intelligence would have discovered that this was allowed to happen. The Israelis are not incompetent. They had plenty of warning. They knew what was coming. And then, of course, as Max Blumenthal has pointed out, much of what was reported about that event turned out to be utterly false. And they weren't satisfied just to say, look what happened. They wanted to elaborate because they were trying to mobilize their country and the United States and the West in their behalf. Now, I think a lot of that is worn off. But remember that the problem in the United States has always been the same. If you don't kill large numbers of us on a given day, if we don't lose 500 or 1,000 men in 24 hours, what do we care what happens overseas? Most Americans simply don't care. You know, this goes back years ago. I remember when Newt Gingrich was trying to confront Bill Clinton over the budget. And Newt Gingrich did something everybody advised him not to do. He effectively shut down the government. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
And
definitely.
Ultimately, the winner in this contest was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton said, fine, go ahead, shut down the government, see how that works out. Give me a call. And eventually they called and said, oops, this is a mistake. Why? I listened to a young man on a bike in San Francisco or somewhere near San Francisco. He was stopped by a reporter on the street, some local station, and he had a case of beer strapped to his bicycle. And they said, sir, what do you think about the government shutdown? He said, well, you know, it doesn't really affect me. I don't care. He said, you don't care? He said, well, look, I got a case of beer. I'm going to go home and watch the game. That's where we are. We're still there until something really shakes us up. FDR had this problem in the 1930s. He had to bring on Pearl Harbor. Now, he didn't know it was going to be Pearl Harbor. He thought it was going to happen first in the Philippines, but he did everything he could to goad the Japanese into war. So much so that in June of 1941, when he made it clear, we're going to embargo the Japanese, no more oil, tin, rubber, everything, that Marshall called the CNO and said, we need a joint planning conference. They had a joint planning conference, said, we know what's coming next, war with Japan. Now, that's fact. They knew it was inevitable once that embargo was imposed. And everything was done to stall, to obstruct, to disrupt any kind of negotiation with Japan that might have led down a different path. And the Japanese, as we know, attacked. And remember what Hirohito said after the attack. Well, we've launched our attack. We've made our point. Now we want peace. And what did Donald Trump say? We made our attack. That's it. And now we're going to have peace. It's back to Donald Trump's theory of warfare. Bomb in the morning, send coffee and sandwiches over in the afternoon, and by 6 p.m. you have a peace agreement. No. Impossible. Yeah. What we're seeing is really what a lot of people are pointing to and saying, this is the beginning of World War III. What's happening in the Middle East, not what's happened in Ukraine, but what's happening in the Middle East. And could that have an impact in Ukraine? Of course it can. It's going to end the Ukraine war sooner. In other words, the gloves come off, it's over, done, because we Russians are focusing elsewhere. But in the meantime, the globalist elites will use all of this as a justification for more spending and a larger surveillance state and laws against free speech.
Yeah, none of which are America first, but we have what we have. And listen, I really appreciate you coming on and providing such clarity and information that rarely gets talked about here, especially in concert and all these things together. So we really appreciate that. Thanks very much, Doug.
Well, we're all in the same boat because we voted for the man on the assumption that he meant any of what he said. We turned out to be wrong.
Turned out to be wrong. Well, we'll leave it there for the time being. And we value you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done it on the way out so you can keep getting great information like this and great shows like with the ever popular Doug Macgregor. Thank you very much. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.